So, the segue, thank you. So since most people here are natural scientists or some affiliation to that kind of information, we're going to start by talking about scientific method. You've heard of this, I hope. So, a couple of questions here. How can the uptake of BMPs be increased? And I thought this was a question until I was talking to Kirsten at lunch, and I said, okay, are we at the point where we know all these BMPs are good things, we just don't know how good? And it's like, no, some of them might actually be counterproductive. And then Tom's talk kind of reinforced it. I was like, oh no. So it's not quite as simple. But another question that's behind this is, does the Living Lab program actually serve to increase BMP uptake? That's been something that's mentioned before too. Like, we're putting millions of dollars into this program, does it actually do anything? So there's two research questions. Okay. Well, the next thing we would do is do some background work. So this is not an original question. And financial, so first item, it's been coming up a lot. Knowledge, do people know about these things? Attitudes. So that's what Shabtai was just kind of alluding to too. There's a lot more to it than just the financial. Norms, which would be not only your own attitudes, but what about the community that you're in? How do they impact on your decision making? So that's the type of things that have been found by other people who research these kind of questions. Okay. So the next thing you do in a piece of research is you come up with some hypotheses. So the very broad hypothesis is the uptake is going to be influenced by all these. Okay, pretty big hypothesis there. How are we going to conduct an experiment? Well, this is what the survey tool is all about. So we're developing a survey to assess the uptake experience or intention. And Hans Buechler, when we talked to him, really emphasized that in wine grapes, and this would be true in other perennials, there's such a long period of time. There may not actually be a whole lot of implementation in 5 years, but the knowledge and the intention to take this up. Like, you think of irrigation systems, you don't just, well, somebody says drip is better, I'm going to change it tomorrow. It's like, well, if you just invested in micro sprinklers 2 years ago and they've got a 10-year life, you're not going to change that right away. So there's a time span that's involved in adoption too. And it may be intentions more than adoption for some commodity groups. That's the important thing to measure. Analysis, this is where you send the academic away with a computer and they do a bunch of statistics and come back and tell you something, and hopefully you actually believe it rather than it just being lies, damn lies, and statistics. And of course, the last step is some conclusions based on that. Okay, so run through this. But a little bit of an example might give a context to the things that we might be trying to measure and why they're important. So the little blue sort of triangle thing is a piece of land along the Fraser River that was part of my parents' family farm. Some of you may know this part of the world. On the shores of the Fraser River, I really enjoyed working that land because I'd sit there in the summer and the Woodside on the other side, and they're hang gliding off there. And I spent my day driving the tractor back and forth, watching hang gliders. Beautiful place to be. Now I'll zoom in a little bit, and just along the Fraser River, what happens in this valley some of the time? What's happening right now? We're having these wonderful outflow conditions. That's going to be very central to this story. So, sometime in the early 90s, my dad was really big into attending the dairy short course every year. And he really liked learning about new ways to do things. And we'd been already doing some cover crops in the winter, and it was recommended at the time to do a winter pea and winter wheat. So your peas add nitrogen, your wheat breaks down better, and the combination of the two, if you can harvest them, are really good feed. So you should plant this. So we thought, okay, we'll give it a try. So the promise, really good green manure, reduces erosion, of course, that's one of the things cover crops do. The land had a few hills on it and stuff, so that would have been a good thing. High quality silage. Well, nobody was talking about carbon in the 1990s, but it would have contributed a little bit there too. So that's the promise. Okay, a lot of really potentially good things here. What happened? Well, just like is going on right now, we got a winter Arctic blast when this cover crop was not yet dormant, and it killed about half of it or more. And so we'd spent all this time learning about this thing, and then we put in the effort to prepare the soil for it. Then we figured out how to adapt the seed drill we had to put peas in the ground, because that's not something that we did very often. And then it didn't work. So that's not really a good experience. So what did we do as a result? Well, we went back to what we were doing before, which was fall rye, which is tough. It's not as good feed. If it gets away from you, it's very hard to work back in because it's really fibrous, but it survives that winter blast. So that's kind of the BMP experience, and the uptake question includes all these kind of things. And so we started out with an intention to do this because of all the promising things. And then we had an experience, and our intention subsequently changed. And now I'll line that out a little bit more detail in how, as a social science researcher, you might build a framework to understand how this decision process happened and what things you might like to measure in order to understand it. So here's the BMP, the practice, pro-environmental practice. It's using a pea and wheat cover crop. Okay, well, you're not going to do it if you don't intend to do it. So one of the first things you need before any kind of practice is uptake is that somebody has an intention to do it. Whether that intention turns into the behavior is going to depend on stuff like enablers. So is there some sort of financial aid? And we talked about that, some sort of subsidies and other stuff to make it easier for people to adopt these things. If they're there, that increases the likelihood that an intention is going to turn into a practice. If there's some kind of insurance, if we suffered this loss, I don't think there was any crop insurance we had available to deal with that. If you're trying with something new, it's not part of the crop insurance program, you're on your own. So maybe some sort of insurance to help out, to encourage people to try new things. These are enablers. Equipment too. Maybe there's some way that there can be equipment made available for people to trial things. You don't then have to spend a few tens of thousands of dollars to buy something that then doesn't work, and you're done, your money's gone. So those are enablers. Constraints. How much extra time does it take? Now that's a really important one, I think, that we don't always think about. Time is something that people don't have a lot of. Farmers tend to be kind of busy. They fill their schedule pretty full. Asking them to do something new and different that's going to take a lot of time means time's taken away from something else. So it doesn't, that knowing what that time impact is, the cost of adoption, the equipment needs, those can be constraints. So taking that intention and turning it into an action, those are things we need to understand. And so we should be measuring those things. But as Shabtai's question is, that intention has other factors that drive it as well. So attitudes. Attitudes are things I'm thinking about that contribute to whether or not I'm going to have this intention. Do I believe it's actually going to work? If I don't think it's going to work, I'm not going to intend to do it. Is it something I care about? Again, Shabtai kind of alluded to that. If I really care about climate change and I believe it's important to do whatever I can, I may be willing to take on some bit of a cost if I know that I'm going to be reducing my carbon emission. So attitudes can be really important there as a contributor to an intention. Norms as well. Views of my peers. What are the other farmers I regularly interact with think about these BMPs? Broader social value, pro-environmental values, etc. Family and friends. So some young family member who's going to UBC in the agriculture program takes a soil science course and comes home and says, "Hey, Dad, what do you think about this?" Yeah, this guy.
That's why you don't live in the farm anymore.
Yeah. Good. So,
Very
good job. So, control. Do I know how to do it? And somebody may have told me this is a great idea, but I haven't got enough information to actually know how to do it. Worries about if it doesn't work. I mean, our experience was we could afford this. The farm was doing okay. So it didn't like cripple us. But if somebody's just starting out and they've got big mortgage payments, and now you're asking them to try something and they're just right on that cusp of getting by, they're probably not going to do it. So that downside risk, how do they manage that? do they think they have the time and money? Like, there's a question of how much it actually costs. There's also, what do I think it's going to cost? The thing that affects the intentions is what I think. So perceptions. So measuring these things here will give us some idea about things that are contributing to or blocking an intention of adopting a BMP, of actually even emerging. And then these things are going to be affected by things like age and education, people's values and beliefs, the role of the farm in their overall income. So if they're just a little hobby farmer and they have some other job, it's like, yeah, okay, I want to be an organic farmer and minimum impact and all of that. And it doesn't matter if it makes money. There's people like that out there. There's a lot of them in the open market. Lifestyle farmers, big deal out there. So there's kind of my overview that presents kind of a framework about how you can bring these things together to think about different factors that may influence whether or not someone's going to intend to take up a BMP and actually do it. Now, there's also a dynamic aspect. And thank you, Kirsten, for mentioning the dynamics earlier. I was scrambling to add this slide as we were going along here. So, and this links into some of the stuff I'm talking about as well. So we've got a whole bunch of producer population there. There's some chunk of them right now who have an intention to try these things, like all these years ago, my family farm, my dad trying out these peas and winter wheeling. Some of this stuff's not that new. It's just not really done very much. Okay, so there was that intention there, and some of those intentions are actually turning into adoption. That's going on right now. And we'd like to know what's going on right now. Now, we can divide that producer population up into what I've done is 3 different groups here. I call them the fringe. It fits in the space there. But there's a lot of, oops, there we go.
Rather than what we call fringe.
No, I guess not, yeah. Oh, and that's back now. So those people in the fringe are ones who are really not that. Okay, are not affiliated with the Living Labs. There's participants who are right engaged with the Living Labs, and then there's the interested people who are curious about the Living Labs, but they're not quite involved. Okay, and just for the purpose of thinking about the Living Lab program, we can divide the farms up that way. Now, we can take those folks who have the intentions right now and who are practicing the BMP, and we can divide them up. There may be some people in that fringe who are already trying this, but they're not going to have anything to do with the Living Lab program. And there's some people who are interested who are already trying this stuff. And there's, of course, a bunch of participants. They're quite interested. That's why the purple thing is bigger there than the yellow. And that's why the green is also bigger. There's more of them who are willing to try. They wouldn't be participants otherwise. So that's when we do the Living Lab activities. So our first survey is trying to get what's going on initially. How many people are there out there who are thinking about doing this stuff and actually maybe wanting to do this stuff? How many are actually doing it? How many have even heard about these practices? What are the attitudes? Like getting a picture, this baseline picture, that's on the left-hand side. And then we do a bunch of this stuff. That's our experimental treatment in the middle. And then at the final stage, we want to repeat the survey. And well, what we might see, we kind of hope we see, is that this interested group, the intention has gotten bigger, more than want to do it, and the number who are actually doing something has gotten bigger as well. And again, emphasizing what Hans was telling us when we talked to him, for some commodity groups, it may be the intention that gets a lot bigger, but just because of the nature of their production system and the time it takes to change things, there may not actually be a lot of observed uptake yet, but there may be a lot more intention. So we want to measure that intention. We don't just want to measure the uptake. What might we see among the participants? Well, maybe go down. We don't want to see it go down, but maybe we actually help some people see that this is a dumb idea on their part. Which is probably good information, actually. It's not a bad thing. Making sure that we're getting these things in place in the right place, as opposed to saying everybody should do this. Maybe everybody shouldn't do this. And maybe we learn something by working with these farmers to figure out who shouldn't be doing it. Now, what happens in the fringe? These people are not participating in living labs, but the world doesn't stop and they don't get frozen for 5 years while we do our living lab stuff. They listen to the news, they read producer newsletters and other such things, and magazines from the US to talk about farming and stuff. And so they may find out about these BMPs and hear about some of these secondary benefits that they get and stuff and say, hey, I'm going to give this a try. And we need to be able to compare the change, what happens in the fringe, and the fringe might change too, against what the living lab does. We can't just look at the living lab in isolation. So we got to be aware that the rest of the population is changing too. That's why that fringe or periphery is really important to measure. We can't ignore them, because if we do, then we're not actually accurately measuring the impact of the living lab. Which is true whenever we talked about controls for any of the other stuff that we're talking about today. It's the same kind of thing. We need to control for the other influences that are going on out there, because the world's not a static place. Okay, so returning to this. So basically the previous work shows that the stuff in all of these boxes matters, and Tim did some work. So this is what he did. He did some background literature work. He did a keyword search to find a bunch of different academic sources to read through, and then read 57 different papers. 32 of them were quite useful. And he identified from that what some of the drivers and some of the barriers were to the adoption of BMPs. And each paper was focused on different BMPs, and some of them were relevant here and some of them weren't. But the idea is, what sort of things motivate people to do this? Drivers, things that contributed positively to adoption rates. If you look at the three biggest bars at the bottom, information is an important one. If you don't know about it, you're not going to do it. Economics is a big one as well. And education. Those are kind of the three big positive ones. So if it pays off positively, yeah, that is an important one. So we got to measure those things, but got all those other things too. They're not zero. So there are other things that also have an influence. Again, you could organize these to fall into those various boxes that I have in the figure. Things in various different aspects of people's process of deciding what to do are more complicated than just the economics. The economics are really important, but they're not the only thing. And so we should be measuring those other things as well. And looking at the barriers, well, here's where economics really stood out. It is a barrier. If you can't afford to do it, if it's not going to contribute positively to your business, you're probably not going to do it. So we can't ignore the economics. It is really central, and doing good analyses of the financial impacts of adopting these things is important. It's just we shouldn't stop there. We should also look at the other things that might influence decisions. Okay. So our hypotheses. So things are going to matter in all these boxes. The role of them is going to differ by commodity. To be able to identify what those differences are, though, we want to make sure to be asking the right questions. And the role of the features will also differ by individual. Different farmers are different people. They respond to different things. And we got to think about those things too. So how do we do this survey? We want to construct measures that capture aspects of all of these different features in that map I made. It would be really great to have common measures across the commodities, because that's going to enable us to detect difference. So just like has come up several times, it would be really great if we can use the same lab, because then we don't have variations across labs that confound our results. Same sort of thing here. If we can have a standard list, as Hans said, a list of things we want to measure that everybody is measuring across the different commodity groups, yes, this one factor, the cost of seed, might be really important to one commodity group and not to the other. But if we measure it for all of them, then we can see that it's not important. Whereas if we decide beforehand, oh, well, this one's not important, then actually we can't conclude it's not because we didn't bother measuring it. We want to ensure that we do get the unique factors of each commodity as well. We don't want to end up ignoring things that are different between the commodities. And as I've already been emphasizing, we want to make sure to sample the participants who are actively involved in the living lab, the interested people, the ones who show up to the field days and the workshops and stuff, and the people who don't. And that's going to be the really hard thing. We're really going to need help from the producer organization in reaching out to those fringe or the other name that I can't remember right now, to help us figure out how to reach those people. So that's going to be hard for us to do as researchers ourselves. We're going to need a lot of help with that and suggestions on how to do it. So, and final thoughts. I title this Respect because basically research ethics is about respecting humans who give you their time and their information, and how do you treat them with respect in the process. So some producers, and there may be other data contributors too, but producers are certainly the core of this, may consider some of the information that we would like to have as private. And therefore, we have to be committed to securely storing this data so that it's not something that just kind of ends up out there somewhere. That's really important. So all involved in the data collection must have a commitment to respecting this confidentiality and privacy to the people who are contributing the data to us. So the primary data, the survey data we collect, cannot be shared. It can only be used by people who have made that same commitment. And it cannot be archived and made public. That's something like the idea that we're going to collect socioeconomics and throw it into some big data thing. It's like, no, it's not big data. It is private data that people have given to us and trusted us to take care of it for them and use it to address some specific questions. And we have a responsibility as social science researchers to do that. And the easiest way to actually be close to doing that is to work with the university's research ethics boards to make sure we've made those commitments and put in place the protections. And there's never 100% guarantee, but if you work with the research ethics board at a university, the odds are pretty good that they're going to make you think very carefully about these things and have protocols and procedures. So that's the end of my slides.